Thanks, Kent. That is a great introduction to the next panel. We have to transition now and get the folks on the next panel mic'd up. So while we do that, I will start to introduce and motivate the panel. As Kent said, this panel is different than the other panels in the sense that what we are having here are not winners and finalists from the Ivy Prize, but perhaps some applicants or winners for next year. As Kent said, I think one of the issues that's really instrumental to trying to get housing that's more affordable is how do we deal with regulatory issues that may impede innovation in design, construction, or financing, or the like. I think in the past year, there have been two notable breakthroughs, as people would say, I think. One in the city of Minneapolis, who has now, among other things, eliminated single-family zoning throughout the city and allowed for up to 3 units on those sites. And also in the state of Oregon, which has also passed legislation that will reduce the ability for municipalities to have single-family zoning and increase density in those sites. So we thought as part of a capstone of this day, it would be really interesting to have representatives of those two places come to be able to speak about what it is and how it is that they got those innovations through. And while we're at it, given that we're here in Massachusetts, I go around the country on panels and talk about these issues, and a lot of people want to talk to me about Chapter 40B in Massachusetts. Now, I know we may be preaching to the choir a little bit, but we wanted to both talk about that and talk about some of the initiatives that are now making their way through the Massachusetts legislation, the Housing Choice Act in particular, to try to overcome some regulatory opposition to housing development. So, to that end, we wanted to have Undersecretary Janelle Chan with us as well. So I think all 3 of these folks are getting mic'd up and will make their way up here shortly. This is probably where I should go to Carol's karaoke to fill in a bit. So come on up as you're ready. I'll use this as a chance to also say some early thank yous. These events are an enormous logistical event to pull off. Several people at the Joint Center who do this and do this well are deserving of special thanks. David Luberoff, the Deputy Director of the Center, was instrumental in organizing the panels, recruiting people, helping to get us all organized. Carrie Donahue, who couldn't be with us today, oversees all of our events. James Chackness, who's over here working right now. I also want to give a shout out to Matt Smith, the hardest working man at the GSD, I think, who oversees a lot of the technical aspects of these events. And of course, again, Clark and Ivory. Clark, obviously, it's all Clark. He says it's all Abby, and I don't know that he's actually being just who have done an enormous. I can tell you, I travel around the country, and everywhere I go, people know Abby Ivory now after how much beating the bushes they have done. All right. So let me briefly introduce our panel. So right here on my side, we have Janelle Chan, who's the Undersecretary of Housing and Community Development for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Janelle is also a Loeb Fellow, or a previous Loeb Fellow, so has a connection.
You're always a Loeb Fellow.
You're once a Loeb Fellow, always a Loeb Fellow. I also noticed on your bio that you had an undergraduate degree from UC Berkeley, so there's a Berkeley connection that continues throughout today as well. Janelle, thank you for being with us. In the middle, we have Taylor Smiley Wolfe, who's the Director of Policy and Planning for Home Forward, which you may not recognize from its name, but it's a public housing authority in Portland, Oregon. I think was the name recognizes the kind of ways in which they're doing very innovative approaches to housing. But before that, she was Policy Director for Representative Tina Kotek in Oregon, who was instrumental in passing the legislation that we're going to be talking about today. And then last but not least, we have Andrea Brennan, who's the Director of Housing Policy and Development for the city of Minneapolis. Thank you all for being with us today. We've structured this panel a little different than the others too. Rather than force people into short presentations, we're going to structure this more as a conversation. We had framed some questions for the panelists to go through. What I'd like to do, I'm going to break it up a little bit and try to smaller chunks. So first I want to go down and say, can you tell us more detail than I just did about exactly what change happened in Oregon and Minneapolis that we're talking about today? So Andrea, maybe we'll start with you in Minneapolis. So tell us exactly when we say that single-family zoning's been eliminated in Minneapolis, what actually change has taken place?
Sure. Thanks, Chris. In
December of 2018, the City of Minneapolis City Council adopted a comprehensive plan called Minneapolis 2040. And Minneapolis 2040 eliminated single-family exclusive zoning, also eliminated parking requirements, and allowed for increased density along transit corridors. So what we mean by eliminating single-family zoning, it means that in lower density zoned districts, on a single lot, instead of just being able to develop one residential unit, now under Minneapolis 2040, there's the ability to develop up to 3 units. So it's not a minimum requirement, but it allows for the flexibility to develop anywhere from 1 to 3 units on single lots in lower density districts.
Great. So Taylor, in Oregon, what exactly took place there?
Yeah, so in the 2019 legislative session, the Oregon legislature took a really broad and comprehensive approach to the housing crisis in the state by passing a suite of housing legislation and making some really significant investments in affordable housing development and homeless services. The 2 bills that are most notably, I think, recognized around the country are the tenant protections bill that passed, which made Oregon the first state in the country to establish a statewide cap on rent increases every year, and also established a statewide just cause standard for evictions. So this was really huge, historic, and monumental legislation. And then the state also took a lot of action on the pro-housing supply side, which was a combination of zoning reform and trying to get at a longer-term sort of systematic approach to how we do local land use planning and how cities are held accountable to meeting their housing needs. So the Housing Rezone Bill, House Bill 2001, did what was actually very similar to Minneapolis, but at a statewide level. So it requires cities above a certain size to allow duplexes on each lot that allow a detached single-family home, but then also to allow triplexes, quads, townhomes, and cottage clusters in single-family neighborhoods. So those are the 2 really big bills. There are a number of other ones, but I'll just stop there so we can get into more detail.
Great. And Janelle, I don't want to leave you out. So the Housing Choice Act that's making its way through the legislature, can you talk a bit about that and what are the components of that and how that might help the affordable housing situation in the Commonwealth?
Sure. I think I'd like to provide a little bit of context of what we're calling as a housing crisis. In 1990, we were producing about 30,000 units of housing per year. Right now, we're producing about half of that. And to give you a sense of how many, what the need is going to be, or need is right now, is that in the past 4 years, we've added 200,000 new jobs in Massachusetts. So that math doesn't quite add up, right? We're just not producing enough for what we currently need, and also for the future as we're projecting out. And housing choice is one element and one tool in which that we want to use to help us solve this housing crisis. What it does is the governor reintroduced a bill that lowers the voting threshold for changing zoning as related to housing. I hope most folks here on November 5th went and voted. When you elect your officials, it's a simple majority, right? It's like 51%. However, in Massachusetts, for whatever reason, we make it harder for us on communities to do the right thing around housing. Right? So for ADUs, for lowering parking ratios, for lowering the dimensional requirements for housing, like McMansions, we don't want to encourage more of that, right? For increasing smart growth areas where it's near transit, near town centers, we want to increase mix of uses. Those type of zoning rules, and if you want to change it, requires 2/3 vote. So it's simple. We want to make it a simple majority. Now, with that said, it has huge significant impacts in terms of making things go forward. In Massachusetts, we have something called towns and not just cities. It's a purest form of democracy, some people might say, but you can gather everyone, whoever shows up in the room can vote in their biannual board town meetings. And so it's not just a simple vote where it's a city council, maybe there's 5 and you need 4 of those 5. You might need the whole room, 2/3 of that room to get something passed, and that's difficult. What that means, it's not removing control from local communities, right? It's actually giving them more control. It's saying that a minority of citizens doesn't control the fate of the majority. That's what we are doing as a state. We're allowing cities and towns to realize their ambitions and meet their needs.
Great. So we have 2 examples of legislation that have passed. One that's making its way through the legislature with the governor's strong backing and a lot of other strong backing. The politics of changing these kinds of controls or development
Super
are
easy.
super
Just
easy.
kidding. Just joking.
That's why we have Taylor here with us today. What is the secret? So that's the question. So I'd like to ask each of you is, in the case of Minneapolis and Oregon, well, I'll start with you again, Andrea. How did the stars align for this actually to come to pass in Minneapolis? And I'll come down the line. And Janelle, I know the stars haven't aligned yet, but we'll talk a little bit about what's going to take to get those stars to align in Massachusetts.
Sure. So first of all, Minneapolis 2040 is about so much more than eliminating single-family zoning. That has gotten a lot of attention nationally, but the Minneapolis 2040 really puts forth goals around eliminating racial disparities, improving access and affordability of housing for all Minneapolis residents, combating climate change. So all of these things are really are part of what has informed the policy recommendations out of Minneapolis 2040. The intention around eliminating the single-family only zoning designation was for a couple of reasons. One is to provide more housing opportunities in neighborhoods, so to provide more diversity in the current housing options. And secondly, because of the very significant historic representation of single-family zoned neighborhoods. Minneapolis has some of the highest racial disparities in the country, particularly as it relates to homeownership rates. And this is an absolute direct result of past discriminatory policies, redlining through urban renewal policies, through, we could go on and on and on, reciting those. But we really brought this front and center, and that was a really big, important part of the process. So we did things like supported a project called the Mapping Prejudice Project. A university professor, Kristen Delegard and her team went about actually mapping every single racially restrictive covenant, deed covenant in the city of Minneapolis. And we brought those maps out in our community conversation. And that really, there's a lot of conversation that percolated around that. So in terms of the political process, a couple of things. One is that we had really strong elected leadership on this. Our city council president, Lisa Bender, and our mayor, Jacob Fry, were huge proponents of this and really led the charge with their colleagues as well as out in community. The second piece is really a lot of civic engagement. So early on in the process, we adopted a civic engagement plan, and over 2 years, we went out in really non-traditional ways to engage the community. We participated in over 100 meetings, engaged thousands of residents, business owners, and other stakeholders. And the other important part of the process was really organized both opposition and advocacy. So there was a group that organized called Minneapolis for Everyone, and they organized in opposition to 2040. And they had big red signs, yard signs all over certain parts of the city that said things like, "This home is zoned for extinction," or "Please don't bulldoze my neighborhood." And what that gave rise to was another group that organized sort of in response to that. And this other group called themselves Neighbors for More Neighbors. And so they started producing these yard signs that said, end the housing crisis, build more homes now. And they were really an important part of the process. So I would say, really putting forth front and center the issue of race equity was really important. Having really strong elected leadership, having a lot of community engagement and a lot of community voices informing the policy decisions that were being made, and then again, having really good organized advocacy.
Politics is often about compromise. Were there any key compromises that were made along the way to win over folks who might have been opposed to this?
There was, I don't know how much this won over people. It may have had some impact, but initially we proposed and started having conversations with community about allowing up to 4 units. So allowing for 4plexes, up to 4 units on a typical lot. And the reason why we moved from 4 to 3, it wasn't necessarily in response to the opposition, but as we dove into it a little deeper, we didn't see that it was really feasible for 4 units to fit within the existing building envelope of what's allowed for a single-family home.
Great. So Taylor, so not only did you get single-family zoning reduced, but you also got the controls on rent. How did that play out? What were the politics and what was the process to get those things passed?
Yeah, so I would argue that even though the bills themselves weren't linked, that it was really important that tenant protections passed first, because I think one concern that came up at the state level around zoning reform generally and building more housing is naturally concerns about gentrification and displacement. And so I think someone else brought up, you just brought up the McMansions conversation. That was a big one playing out in the city of Portland, where places that were redeveloping, we're seeing the replacement of older single-family homes with brand new single-family homes as opposed to a duplex or triplex, because those things aren't allowed at the local level. So for us, the conversation at the state was really one about like, what kind of an Oregon do we want to be? We know that we're growing as a state. We know that we have an enormous deficit of units. So do we want to be a place that grows in a way that's more inclusive and also environmentally friendly, like Nathan was talking about? Or are we going to be a state that grows out in a really sprawling way? So I think that was the crux of the discussion. But politically, I think, again, it was important to have that tenant protections piece there because it gave some confidence to both renters and folks that were part of racial justice-focused organizations that the state was really committed to the whole spectrum of housing and not just the pro-development side. So that was really important. And we also had a lot of overlaps with the key ingredients that went into what made Minneapolis work. Very strong political leadership. So the Speaker of the House was the chief sponsor of both the tenant protections bill and the zoning reform bill. But she had agreement with the Senate president and the governor that housing was one of their big top 4 priorities for that legislative session. So they made it really clear that they were not going to go home without really big progress on housing, which included the tenant protections and the zoning reform. There were also broad coalitions supporting both of those pieces of legislation with some pretty significant overlap, actually, between who was at the table for both pieces. And then similarly for the zoning work in particular, there was a lot of discussion, a lot of amendments that came through with that work, a lot of stakeholder engagement and outreach to make sure that it was technically feasible to be implemented at the local level.
Great. So Janelle, you got a couple folks here, got things passed. What's the prognosis for the Housing Choice Initiative? How are the politics playing out on that one?
Good question. I think there's no doubt that we are needing more housing in Massachusetts. It's a question of how we get there, right? There are folks who want more in the legislation, and there are folks who are the normal NIMBYs who are scared of change, right? And what we do have is a broad coalition of folks who support the governor's bill. It includes municipal leadership, includes that coalition, as well as home builders, which is a coalition of folks who build homes. It includes Smart Growth Alliance, includes our metro planning area agencies and whatnot. So these are groups of individuals who don't normally get together, but they are getting together behind this one bill. Now, I say that this is not the only thing that we need to attack the housing crisis. This is foundational, and we need it now. We can add more to it, but we need it now. And this administration has been committed to affordable housing, right? We've passed $1.8 billion housing bond bill, largest in our state's history. We've invested $1.1 billion in our affordable housing, which is 19% higher than previously. We ourselves have produced 18,000 units of housing. That's the Department of Housing and Community Development, and supporting those units. So there's no question, be clear, there's no question that this administration is committed and invested in affordable housing. This bill is not a zoning overhaul. This bill is meant to get to production. That's why we try to keep it simple and not try to muck it up, right? So that's the first step, and we are continuing to push for it on all these other areas.
So who's against it?
You can guess. I think you can guess who those are. And I said, yeah, you can always point to a project that you don't like, right? But let's remove ourselves from that. We talk about housing, and the vocabulary used is housing. We're not using vocabulary like Andrea was saying, homes, right? We're talking about neighbors to neighbors, right? We need to start using that vocabulary and win the hearts and minds of those at the local area. I can talk to my state reps, but they answer to who their voters are, right? And so what I notice when I'm going to different communities, there's a new 4-letter word. It's KIDS. And actually 70% of communities in Massachusetts are declining in school age enrollment. So the perception is actually not accurate to what communities actually need. And so part of what we need to do, right, is to talk to local folks, YIMBYs, folks who care about homes, people who can't find homes, right? And that runs the gamut. It's not just folks who are low income. Everyone needs a certain level of affordable housing, right? We're talking about middle income families. We're talking about the folks who graduate from GSD who want to stay in Massachusetts, want to stay in Boston. We're talking about seniors who are aging out of their houses. They can't take care of a 4-bedroom house and mow the lawn and shovel snow, and want to move to a smaller place, right? But they notice that that doesn't exist in their neighborhoods. And those that do, those units that do, aren't in their budget, right? And so we need to change that dialogue, change that narration, and move this legislation along in that way. So I don't know if I answered your question, but this really gets me pissed off. Like, we need to get this passed.
Well, I think one of the things I'm hearing is, and it was evident, I think, in Oregon and Minneapolis too, is that you need the folks who believe in affordable housing to come out on your side too. And I think all too often there's, the NIMBYs, the anti-folks are the ones who are most vocal. And I think, as you say, that this is a broad societal need that can be harder to find their representation. It seems like those groups were important in Oregon and Minnesota.
Yes, and I think also this is why I would emphasize the importance of the role of the state in some of these conversations, because we can talk about sort of changing hearts and minds at the local level, but there was this great study I read once about the states that are more engaged in local land use planning have less segregation by income than states where the state is less involved. And I think that's really important because the political power that exists at the local level around those who yield it and those who don't typically end up protecting exclusively single-family neighborhoods at the expense of the very small areas that are zoned to allow more affordable housing types. So I actually think that state-level involvement is really key. So in addition to messaging and communicating very clearly that we're talking about people's homes, we also need to be realistic about who's winning in our current status quo scenario and who's losing, and if the state can help kind of even out that balance.
Well, in Massachusetts, we have 40B, which for those of you who don't know, this is a situation where if a town doesn't have 10% of its housing stock deemed to be affordable, then there's a process by which developers can appeal to the state to overcome local zoning or local lack of approvals for that process, where the kind of burden of proof shifts from the developer proving that the project's not going to have a negative impact to the town having to make that proof. And 40B has been around since, I guess this is the 50th year anniversary. 1969 it was passed. It went through a referendum not that long ago, 2012 I think, sometime around then, and passed again. And so maybe Janelle, this might be a good opportunity. Taylor's talking about the importance of state involvement. This is an example of that. So how well is 40B working today? I know there's a number of communities that have actually now exceeded 10%. Is 40B still effective in helping to get affordable housing in communities throughout the Commonwealth?
Well, 40B is often looked at as the big bad wolf, right? If cities and towns aren't doing their part in producing affordable housing, then the state says, hey, your zoning rules are not applying, and we need to push forward more affordable housing. So how do we measure success, right? We try to define what the need is, and 40B has been a useful tool in terms of producing housing. It's produced about 70,000 since it started in 1969. So it's been utilized, right? What's important to note about 40B is, I'm not that great at math, but I'll start. There's a numerator and a denominator. The numerator is what's listed in the subsidized housing inventory, and what's in the denominator is how many units there are in a community. And every 10 years, it's reset based on the census, right? And so a community, there's about, I think, 70 or so communities that currently qualify, and in the denominator, you could be meeting 10%, but if you're producing a lot of market rate housing right now, that denominator could have grown and you're not producing any affordable housing, you might have dropped off of that. So you might be at risk of 40B. So it always changes. Is it still useful in the future? I think so. I think we'll see in the next, the 2020 census, how many folks still stay on that list. But there is a motivation to produce more affordable housing still with this tool. There's difficulties and challenges with 40B, right? If a community really doesn't want it, if an abutter really doesn't want it, right? And there's ways to muck up the system, right? There's through lawsuits, through appeals, and whatnot to slow it down. And that oftentimes kills projects, right? So it isn't the answer to everything, but it is one of the important tools that Massachusetts does have.
Great. I want to come back to the situation in Portland, Oregon, and Minneapolis in Oregon. These are legislation that's been passed. It was a comprehensive plan that was then has to be turned into regulations and an ordinance, zoning ordinance. So I guess so from here, what are the key things to look for to see whether or not these changes are actually going to have an effect at the ground level? What are the key next steps, and where are we in the implementation process?
Sure. So in Minneapolis, as you stated, the comprehensive plan is the policy, but in order for it to actually be implemented, a zoning code text amendment or amendment is required. So Minneapolis 2040 comp plan was approved. It will be effective January 1. The City Council has already adopted the regulatory reform needed through the zoning code ordinance. That will also be effective January 1, which means that up to 3 units in lower density areas will be as of right. Additionally, the city will be considering in December a comprehensive inclusionary zoning policy and ordinance that, if approved, will also be effective on January 1. So that means that as we're allowing increased residential density throughout our neighborhoods, throughout our, especially along transit corridors in terms terms of a much higher residential density. Inclusionary zoning will ensure that there's some affordability as that development occurs. I think both panelists too, Taylor and Janelle both mentioned the comprehensiveness of the approach to affordable housing and housing choice and opportunity, that it's not just one thing. It's, we like to say there's no silver bullet, but maybe there's silver buckshot. So if we get enough things all working together, and so implementation of 2040 is going to involve not just the three things I mentioned, but our council just also this year adopted a pretty strong tenant protections ordinance, and there's more of that type of policy work that is on the horizon as well. And then in terms of, land use policy is certainly not, it's necessary but not sufficient in order to really see the kind of affordable housing and housing that we need in our city. And so the city is also implementing a very robust strategy that involves increased investment in affordable housing preservation and production, a lot of new sort of innovative piloting of new initiatives, such as new ways to preserve our market or naturally occurring affordable housing. Another thing that we're working on as part of implementation is now that land use policy and zoning regulation allows for more of this missing middle development, what can we do to encourage that kind of development and make sure that there's some affordability component to that kind of development. So we issued a pilot, an RFP pilot, calling for proposals for missing middle that has some affordability component to it. And we didn't really know what to expect, but we got a really strong response. And so we're really excited about that. So we're going to be really busy implementing, and we're going to learn a lot in 2020, and we're really looking forward to doing that.
Yeah, and I think in Oregon, the next step will, of course, be implementation. So cities have until 2021 and 2022, depending on their size, to actually update their local land use regulations to allow middle housing. So that's step one. The second piece is that there obviously needs to be yielding of this housing type for it to be considered a success, right? Allowing it isn't enough to make sure that more inclusive communities are created. So it's not just that the housing is being developed, but that it's also being developed oftentimes with subsidy to ensure that these units are affordable to folks, specifically, I think, in the context of first-time homeownership for people who've been locked out of homeownership. And through that, the state has an affordable housing development investment fund called LIFT, and that fund has both rental housing development set-asides and then homeownership set-asides. And a number of the organizations that ended up supporting the middle housing bill have expertise in developing homeownership opportunities in middle housing in areas where it's allowed, with a focus on serving communities of color. So I think that's really important, making sure to continue investing in that work so that this change can actually yield the outcomes that I think legislators were really looking for when they agreed to make it. So again, zoning is just the beginning. Without more flexible zoning, you can't achieve these things at all, but it's just the starting point, and a lot more work needs to happen. One other data thing. The bill does include requirements that cities every year send information to the state about how many middle housing units they permitted and constructed, so we can actually track how that's going.
I guess one question for each of you, maybe I'll start with you, Janelle, too, is, and you probably get this all the time, I'm sure you folks do too, and with the other Ivy Prize winners, I'm sure that you're spending a lot of time on the road responding to requests for speaking, is how exportable are the lessons from Massachusetts, Oregon, and Minneapolis? Are there unique aspects of the circumstances here that, but if someone comes to you from Buncombe County and then says, what can I learn from what you've done? What do you think of as exportable lessons?
Well, I think housing costs is a huge issue here, not just in terms of what rent is and what it costs to buy, but also just the actual production of housing. And we have labor costs, and we have tariffs or whatnot. Yeah, there's a lot of costs that have continued to increase. In many ways, Massachusetts is a victim of its own success, right? and we have a lot of folks who want to live here, and that increases the demand. What's exportable is we're trying to pilot a lot of different programs, and I hear actually it feels like we're all thinking along the same lines, like for the Hello Housing in Oakland, we ourselves here in Massachusetts, we're piloting, looking at using, and we are imbuing a nonprofit with eminent domain rights, right, to help with blight in these smaller properties across different cities and towns. And those cities identify those areas of blight, and we're figuring out how do we take those and put them back into use, right? Contribute back to the communities. And so I think on a state level, we're trying to figure out how do we do that on the local level and give them those type of supports. I think let's see how that goes, and maybe we should talk after this, right? The other area that we're looking at is our public housing. We have 241, sometimes they merge, but public housing agencies throughout Massachusetts. We have one of the biggest state portfolios in the US. And how we're looking at our assets is that's an asset. That's a lot of land, right? And some of this land is in Wellesley, is in really nice areas. It's in Chelsea, it's in Somerville, and we're doing a pilot in Somerville and Chelsea, actually. That's areas that are next to Boston. They're on the up and up, if not they're already there, to look at how do we use those properties as a way to increase housing production. How do we invite the private market in to help us put more capital into our public housing stock, to update those units, as well as producing more mixed income, as well as market rate on that site. So there's a lot of things that we're learning right now, but the ultimate, what makes success is if it's portable and if it's scalable. So to be continued.
Great. Taylor?
Yeah, I have so many thoughts on this one. I think the first is have high expectations for the state. I think the states oftentimes get left out of the conversation around housing and responding to big crises like housing. And so holding states accountable for taking action and doing their part to address the crisis is huge. In that note, I would also say go big at the state level. Legislators in Oregon went really big with a broad spectrum of different solutions, and were really successful in passing a number of landmark legislation that I think is rippling around the country in terms of what other states are doing. Not that we love anything more than being California, but we did pass a tenant protections bill before they did, woo, which is exciting. So healthy competition between states is good. And then the last thing I would say as a lesson from Oregon is celebrate the wins in the short term, but gear up for the long game, because addressing the housing crisis is going to take an extremely long time. It took years and years of really intentional policy, especially on the affordability and racial segregation side of things, to create the world and system that we have today in housing markets across the U.S., and it's going to take years of intentional effort to undo that work and actually build those more inclusive communities. So I would say make sure that you are celebrating wins, but getting ready for the long work ahead.
Great, Andrea.
I would echo what Taylor just said about the intentionality. So we didn't get here by accident, and we're not going to get out of this situation without very, very clear intentional both policy, investment, regulatory changes, all of that. And so I think just being clear about that. And one of the best articles that I've seen on the Minneapolis 2040 plan was recently published in The Atlantic about, I think it was something like how Minneapolis defeated NIMBYism. And it talked about how there are victims of single-family zoning, and that the city put those victims front and center. And I think that's doing that and being really real and direct about the harm that has been caused by past discriminatory practice and policy that was very intentionally done is really important to highlight. And so that's a lesson I think we can all learn from. The second thing I would say is just the power of having a very robust community engagement process. It was hugely influential for us. a lot of what came out of Minneapolis 2040 was really, were things that came up as such strong themes from this extensive community engagement that I think it allowed us to be bolder than we would have been if we wouldn't have done that. And you have to really do it in non-traditional ways. You have to go to where people are gathering already, bring food, talk to people on the train, show up at community events. So, it's not your typical sort of public meeting. So, so community engagement. Another, I would say, is embrace the, while it's important to go bold, there's also a lot to be said for incrementalism. In 2014, the city of Minneapolis passed an ordinance allowing for accessory dwelling units. And there was a lot of opposition to that, and there was a lot of concern raised in the community about the impact that that would have on neighborhoods. And it passed, and it is being implemented, and no one can point to really any negative impacts of it. And so I think that really helped in this single-family zoning discussion that we had in Minneapolis 2040. Another sort of earlier policy was reducing off-street parking requirements for smaller scale development near transit areas, and that was approved in 2017. And so I think, having a little bit of an incrementalist approach where you can point to policies that have been adopted and implemented where, those things that people were concerned would happen have not in fact happened. I think that that's another lesson that can be learned.
Great. Well, I do want to open it up for questions. I can't see in the back. Is there anybody in the back? Risers? Go up to the risers. Let's go up to the stairs. Those folks have been hanging in all day.
Hi, thank you so much. You touched on this a little bit, but I was wondering if you could drill down for each of the things that you guys have talked about and worked on. Can you just talk about kind of the strategy of a big comprehensive package versus we want to do this one thing that would make a really big difference, and kind of the work that takes the community engagement, the proposal itself, and getting that through versus the benefits and the political fallout as well, or potential.
Big question.
Do you mean the political strategy around some of that work, or are you just talking about like what it takes to do a sort of a broad menu of options in a legislative setting?
The first one, the
okay.
political piece.
Janelle?
I think there's two parts to that. One is defining upfront the process that you're going to use. So again, with Minneapolis 2040, one of the really, I think, looking back, one of the most helpful things that was done was adopting a civil engagement process. So, identifying, and making it clear and being transparent about it so that anyone who wants to engage in that process has ample opportunity to do so. I think without necessarily predetermining exactly, what outcome is, not predetermining the outcome of that process. So that's one piece. And then in terms of, comprehensive agenda versus sort of piece by piece, I think, we actually, most of what we've done has been somewhat sort of policy by policy, but it's really important to be able to tie them together as part of a broader strategy. That doesn't mean that you get everything done at the same time, but it means that you really do have to think about all of this holistically and sort of what aspect of the problem each individual policy or intervention or program is intended to address.
Yeah, and I'm going to respond in a little bit of a different way because I think that's a complicated question. So I think first, we all can acknowledge that there's been a housing crisis happening for an extremely long time for people earning low incomes in communities of color. But this moment is different because the crisis is hitting communities it hasn't hit historically. And so I would say using the political power of the moment to make big changes that might not be possible in other sort of political contexts is an important part of that strategy. Specifically in Oregon, we had a build up to the tenant protections work that happened in 19. That was really propelled forward by a primary race where a senator had been against the tenant protections work, had been primaried by someone who was pro-housing and pro-tenant protections, and that changed the whole dynamic in the Senate around that particular piece. And then similarly on the zoning work, I think a big piece of that strategy is creating a super broad coalition of people who are going to support it for very different reasons and being able to articulate why it means something to so many different people. So from, AARP supported that legislation because of seniors who needed a place to age in place but might not need a large home. So I think the broad coalitions is an important piece of that. And then lastly, identifying legislative champions who are going to stick with you on the whole spectrum. Mm-hmm. So the speaker was instrumental in passing the package of legislation that went forward in 2019, and that was because she was really focused on actually solving the problem, not just getting wins, but really solving the problem, and that meant doing everything on the spectrum. And so having that consistent support from somebody with that much power was really important. Mm-hmm. So that's what I would say.
Ditto. I have to say, Chris, you started by pointing to 40B. That was 1969. We haven't had comprehensive zoning change since 1969. So let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the done.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions on the risers back there? Yeah, right here.
I have a question. I live in a town in Massachusetts that I would say is in an affordability crisis, and it's not just because we're not building enough housing, but we're losing affordable, modest-sized, kind of entry-level homes. They're being, torn down and replaced with homes that are triple the size and 4 times the price. Is there anything? Is that a problem that you've seen and are trying to address? And how would you address it?
I'm happy to take that one first. So that's actually funny because in Oregon, the Portland conversation about infill, I think really ignited this discussion around the state, or was an example of a city having this conversation. And it actually started because people were so upset about McMansions going up in their communities. Mm-hmm. And so then it created this opportunity for other folks, it sounds like your neighbor to neighbor coalition, mm-hmm. to respond and say, we shouldn't be okay with, in the midst of a housing crisis, affordable single family homes being torn down and replaced with McMansions. We should be using this opportunity to increase access to these areas with different housing types. So that absolutely happened. The McMansion was a big theme in the discussions in Oregon and how we could do things differently.
Are there ways in which the regulations can be set? So you're allowing for up to, say, 3 units on a site. There still may be an incentive to do a McMansion if you can sell that for, pick your big number. Are there ways to set the regulations so that you can incentivize creating more units on the site rather than a McMansion? Is that something that's part of what's happening in Minneapolis, Oregon?
Currently, we don't have a process for incentivizing, 1, 2, or 3 over the other. But that's one of the things that we are hoping to get out of our missing middle pilot, are financial incentives that would ensure that if there is a 3-unit development, for example, that there's some affordability included in that proposal. So that's one way. The other is just to understand the market in some of these neighborhoods where, all of our neighborhoods right now are experiencing significant increases in value and price. And, so we're really interested in seeing sort of what the market response is, because, the building envelope remains the same, in terms of what you can build from a bulk and height and setback kind of perspective. And so, the ability, our expectation is that we will get more more affordable price points or affordable rents, and if a development or if a home is built as in the form of 3 homes as opposed to 1 within the same space. So again, just because this is totally new, we haven't seen a lot of this activity, so we don't have a lot of data yet to demonstrate how it will play out. But we expect that opportunity to provide that kind of diversity will be beneficial from an affordability standpoint.
So that you could have different FARs, different height, different setbacks for different numbers of units, but in Minneapolis, it's the same building volume regardless of 1 or 3.
Right.
Is that true in Oregon?
So in Oregon, and again, this is at the City of Portland level, and they've been working on this for a number of years, and I'm not an expert on their proposed code, which hasn't passed yet, but hopefully will soon. I know that advocates they had a really robust conversation around FAR and height and how we could potentially use those tools to discourage the McMansion trend, and encourage the development of middle housing instead. So that was a big part of the discussion, and I know that is being considered when looking at the code. And at the state level, we did have a conversation about incentives. So the bill, this eventually got amended out, unfortunately, but in the bill as it started, there was a provision that would have required cities to waive system development charges for middle housing. As a way to incentivize developers to go in on that type of housing. And system development charges, I don't know if that's the term that's used kind of nationally, but they're just development fees. And so it was deferring the fee until certificate of occupancy is one way to make it a little easier to develop that housing type.
In Massachusetts, we have, in addition to 40B, we have 40R, that allows for cities and towns to get incentive payments if they're planning to include overlay districts in certain areas of smart growth that makes sense. That includes increasing density for starter homes, like 4 smaller units versus single home units versus 1 big house. And so we're trying to put in the incentives, but the market is going to dictate what a developer is going to put in your community. I'm not sure which community you're talking about. I would assume if the market says that they could get more, the developers with 2 units on it, they would go for those 2 units. It's about the city and town allowing that to happen.
All right, I got one more on the risers, then we'll come down on the floor. If we do them quick, we can get a few last ones in.
That's good. Hi, thanks so much for speaking. I'm from Minneapolis, and I remember how, if not like large, but loud the opposition was to 2040. And I know how much of a difference that made in the process, but I'm curious, Taylor and Janelle, if you could speak to the process of getting people who weren't necessarily from urban areas, who are maybe from suburban locations or rural locations, on board with something that seems like it has a pretty direct target in the cities.
That's a good question. Do you want to go first, Janelle?
It's interesting. Our target here is not necessarily in Boston with this legislation. Actually, Boston is not included in terms of this 2/3 simple majority. What the actual impact might be is to increase housing in communities that haven't increased housing, which is around the sort of inner core communities and cities and towns. And so how do you encourage these communities to be on board with this? It's again, translating this to the personal, right? And to that scale, right? We're talking about your neighbors, we're talking about your parents, we're talking about adult children who want to come back into these communities. It's not the other here. And so that's how we're trying to do it in these suburban areas. And housing affordability is not a Boston issue. It's not just an urban issue. And I think oftentimes when we're going throughout the Commonwealth, folks tell us that the affordability there is just, it's an issue as well. So suburban-wise, it's an issue as well.
It's interesting is that the 40B resolution that was on the ballot passed 56% of the vote. I mean, it won in suburban areas too, so it wasn't just a city issue.
Yeah, and for this, I like this question. So for House Bill 2001, the outstanding opposition at the end was local jurisdictions, big surprise. But there was, again, most folks came on in support, and so that opposition was really loud, and it continues to be loud. So I don't know if folks have seen, but there have been some national coverage recently about a couple of cities coming out and very clearly stating that their elected leaders just don't plan to comply with the law. And so this is where I'll take a little bit of an alternative approach and say, carrots are great, great, but they don't work if you're not hungry, and so enforcement is also really important. And the bill actually includes a provision that the state is simultaneously developing a model missing middle code, and so if a local jurisdiction fails to adopt the code by the required date, that code automatically goes into effect. And local jurisdictions are allowed to develop reasonable regulations related to siting and design, and so it's in their very best interest, if they care about preserving neighborhood character, to take that on and develop their own code. But if they don't, then the statewide code would go into effect. And so I don't know if that answers your question. Opposition continued to be loud, but we also worked really closely with cities and as a bipartisan stakeholder work group process to make some amendments to make it easier and more workable for them. So that included things like getting an extension if there were extenuating infrastructure challenges. The state provided $3.5 million in technical assistance for them to do the planning, some of the planning work, and some of the transportation planning. So I think it was a matter of meeting them and meeting cities that continued to oppose, working with them on the technical aspects, but when it came down to philosophical agreements, just agreeing to disagree and moving on.
One last question here on the floor, in the back, in the middle.
Andrea and Taylor, you've both talked about closing the racial homeownership gap, and I'd be interested in any strategies you're using to ensure that people that occupy those homes are people of color. Given existing fair housing laws, how are you trying to accomplish that goal?
Yeah, I can take that one first.
Sure,
That's
go
okay.
ahead.
So as you know, you can't, under the fair housing law, you're not allowed to have requirements related to race and ethnicity. So in Oregon, the focus was really on making sure that there are investments in affordable housing development. And like I said, there are partners in the state who work explicitly on affordable housing development for communities of color that have been locked out of home ownership, but there will not be requirements on the development of that housing being conditioned upon it being provided to a person based on their race or ethnicity, because I believe that that would be a fair housing violation. So.
In Minneapolis, we one of our key strategies is being very intentional about reducing racial disparities in homeownership, and so we've developed a whole sort of suite of program and policy work around this. One of the things that we have found extremely effective is investing in homeownership education, counseling, and more extensive sort of financial or homeownership capacity or wellness. And we have, for the last couple of years, we have invested in the community-based organizations. Most of them are nonprofits. All of them are nonprofits, and a lot of them are provide culturally specific homeownership training, education, programming, and have been really effective and successful in helping Black, Indigenous, people of color in our community move into homeownership and be very successful in homeownership. And so we've really pivoted and partnered with a lot of those kinds of organizations, and then we've made investments in making sure that there's pools of resources for down payment assistance, for example, available to folks who are going through those kind of educational pathways to homeownership. We've done some sort of piloting of new initiatives also. I was really intrigued with the lease to purchase conversations and panel that was happening. We are working with some of our nonprofit partners in community to help create those kind of pathways. We're also working on new policy initiatives that would support like opportunity to purchase. I know Washington, D.C. has a policy, but not just creating that sort of policy of opportunity to purchase, but also then supporting, creating the infrastructure, investing in the infrastructure necessary to help tenants move along that path. So we're increasingly focused on not just looking at moving, homeownership as like one point in time of assisting folks get into a home opportunity, but really thinking about that again along a continuum and ensuring that we're supporting that entire process. Another thing that we're looking at developing, or we are in the process of developing in partnership with our Center for Urban and Regional Affairs at the University of Minnesota, is looking at a preference policy, which I know there are some preference policies. You have to be really careful about how they're crafted in order to be in compliance with fair housing law. But that we have, there are parts of our city that were, like many cities, that were really hit hard by the foreclosure crisis. And as we know, that crisis disproportionately affected people of color. And so on top of that, in Minneapolis, we had a tornado come through one of our neighborhoods that was hit the hardest by the foreclosure crisis. So we're doing a lot of new home development in those communities, and that's where we're really interested in making sure that we can find some way of if possible, providing a preference for folks that have been residents of those communities or have historical ties.
And I know we're close on time. I just wanted to add one thing because you made me think about something else. The legislature also has a task force on addressing racial disparities in homeownership that was appointed by the Speaker and Senate President and includes members from communities who've been historically disinvested in and discriminated against and currently discriminated against in the housing and homeownership markets. And so that task force is currently working on recommendations for the legislature to consider this year about what types of investments should be made. So we're a little bit further, I think, behind in the process than you all are in Minneapolis, but having a robust kind of package around how do we invest in closing those disparities. So I just want to put that.
Well, thank you very much. We are over time. I do want to thank the panelists very much. I mean, I know that all of you are in incredible demand, given the fact that all of you are from places that are leading innovation in this area, and I really appreciate you taking the time. It's wonderful to be able to hear from you directly. So please join me in thanking the panel.
Thank you.
I will like to just once again give a shout out to Clark Ivory. We're here today because of Clark's generosity and the Ivory Prize, the entire Ivory Prize team. I'm going to steal your line, Andrea, about silver buckshot. We often say that there's no silver bullet, but we do have to have a multiple-pronged approach to these things. So I like the silver buckshot. It's a little violent, so I might change that into letting 1,000 flowers bloom. But I think, as I said in my remarks at the beginning, there is reason for optimism. There is a lot of innovation happening in the world. Clark was motivated to create this prize both to identify, surface, and help proselytize these ideas. Hopefully, by today's event, we've helped to do all that. There's really amazing organizations. We are having a reception, so you still have another bite at the apple to chat with people. The receptions are in the porticos. You go out here, go straight down the hallway. I will urge you to leave this room as quickly as you can to go to the porticos to partake in the beverages and the other food that is there, both so that people can clean this room and both so that you can benefit from that. So please join me in thanking Clark, and thank you all for your participation today.